he is the head of all geological mapping in the state of Utah, so he can get busy. so just realize that. But he's going to try to make it here. If he can't, as a last resort, he'll go live stream, but he wants to make it here. Okay, so just to let you know that. Does anybody have any questions before we get started with our speaker today? No? Okay. So I'm going to actually just introduce Dr. Jones here. Norm Jones is a professor at the Civil and Construction Engineering Department at BYU, where he is currently serving as the department chair. He received a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from BYU and received both a master's degree and PhD degree from the University of Texas at Austin. His research interests include groundwater modeling, sustainability, remote sensing, and machine learning. He was the primary architect of the groundwater modeling system, which we call GMS software. It is used by thousands of consulting firms and government agencies around the world. He has 158 publications, including 77 peer-reviewed journal articles, and has been a PI or co-PI on about $15 million in external research funding. In December, he was given the John Hamm Science and Technology Award by the American Groundwater Association. So Dr. Jones is a renowned groundwater scientist, and I would ask you to give your attention to him. So thank you very much. Sorry about that. Right there.
No worries. It is great to be here. I'm going to, since I'm socially distanced here from the front row, I'm going to take my mask off. I can read my lips and communicate a little better. Yeah, it's good to be here. I've always had a warm spot in my heart for Utah Valley University. Lots of friends and family here. My wife was a student here when we met and dated and got married, and so and actually I was a student here at one point as well. It's fun to see the growth you've had here. Very close friend of mine is an associate dean in your business school, and it's just mind-boggling the stories he tells of building construction and faculty hires and student enrollments going crazy. It's an exciting time, and I know several of my colleagues are starting to do joint research with UVU faculty, and I'd love to have an opportunity to do that myself and work with students, and so great to be here. So today I'd like to talk about sustainable groundwater management. And first of all, whenever I give a presentation, I like to start out with why should we care, right? What relevance does this have to us? What is the significance of this topic? Groundwater is one of those things that's out of sight. A lot of people aren't really well educated about it, but it is actually far more critical to our society than you might realize. About 30% of the world's available fresh water is in our aquifers. And about 50% of people in the U.S. Get their drinking water primarily from groundwater. And about 27 trillion gallons of groundwater withdrawn every year in the United States. That's so big, I'm not sure I can wrap my head around that. So, since it's that fundamental as a part of our water resources, we need to make sure we manage it carefully. And we need to make sure we manage it sustainably. So what does it mean to use groundwater sustainably? That's kind of a big theme of this presentation. And so here's a famous quote on sustainable groundwater use. The maximum amount of water of usable chemical quality that can be withdrawn and consumed economically each year for an indefinite period of time. Perennial yield cannot exceed the natural recharge to an area indefinitely and ultimately is limited to the amount of natural discharge that can be salvaged for beneficial use. That's kind of a long technical explanation. What do we mean by that? So here's a diagram of the kind of the groundwater cycle. Let's see which one of these. There we go. So we have precipitation. We have snow melt and snow and rainfall, lands on the ground. Most of that evaporates or is used by plants. Some of it, some subset of that, 5 to 15% typically would percolate down into the groundwater. We call that recharge. And over a large area, that can be quite substantial, right, over a year's period. And then that goes into the groundwater, and so then the groundwater system, prior to putting any wells in, is what we call a state of equilibrium. So that's the water comes in primarily through percolation, and then you have certain areas where the groundwater will seep into streams or lakes or marshy areas, seeps and discharge. Or you have areas with a high water table and the root systems of the plants dip into it, or it's just high enough that there's some evaporation that occurs. We call that evapotranspiration. And so it's a balance where it reaches equilibrium where the amount of water coming in is balanced by water going out. Well, now you put in some wells, what happens? If you start pumping, that's going to pull the water table down. And over time, that will result in a little bit less discharge to evapotranspiration or to streams. And eventually it reaches this new state of equilibrium where it's balanced. Now, if you put in too many wells or you pump too much from the wells, it's unable to regain equilibrium. And you get into what's called a state of perpetual groundwater mining, where we're pulling more water out than the system is capable of replenishing naturally. Unfortunately, a significant percentage of aquifers in the U.S. and around the world are currently in a state of perpetual groundwater mining. We are pulling more water out than is being naturally replenished. And so, the state of Utah passed a law to regulate groundwater in a sustainable fashion, and we're getting there. It's going to take a while. State of California passed a similar law. And so more and more areas are recognizing this is a problem. We're trying to do something about it to get back to a sustainable state. So what are some impacts of non-sustainable groundwater use? Well, first of all, groundwater, you can think of it as a gigantic underwater reservoir. And it's a really valuable resource when you're in a drought, which we are now in the western United States. This is a reservoir in California. This picture was taken during one of the recent droughts, last 10 years. You've seen there are a lot of photos like this now, unfortunately, in our mega drought. This is West Africa. I'm currently doing a research project with NASA in West Africa. They are periodically hit by crippling droughts. Unfortunately, they don't have much groundwater infrastructure. They don't have a lot of big wells and pipes, and so when a drought hits, it's really really damaging to their livestock and to the people and their economy. It's a bad thing. So we rely on groundwater substantially during droughts. The city of Provo, I know they get a lot of their water from droughts and really haven't, Saratoga Springs, some of the other cities are rationing water, and then we conserve water in Provo, but that buffer allows us to get through drought. Well, what happens when you run out of groundwater? Then when a drought hits, you're in big trouble. And so that's one of the reasons to protect your groundwater. You have that available for droughts. If you live near a coast near the ocean, saltwater intrusion, water quality degradation is a real problem. If you pump your groundwater too much near the coast, you'll begin to draw in salt water, and that can really damage your aquifer, and it takes a long time to flush that out sometimes. It's a huge problem in Florida. They have to be really careful how much they pump, or they get salt water in and it messes up their citrus groves and things like that. Dominican Republic did some work there. They've got some real problems with saltwater intrusion. That's another issue. Another one that's kind of interesting is land subsidence. If you, for certain types of soils, once you dewater it, so the water table drops, the soil compresses. So when it's saturated, there's like a buoyancy effect. It weighs less, but once you desaturate it, weighs more and it kind of compresses. And you get some serious subsidence. There are places around the world where the land is sinking pretty substantially. Southern Arizona has pretty serious subsidence. We have it here in Utah. If you, Cedar Valley aquifer down by Cedar City is, they've had substantial overexploitation of the groundwater there. And this is an actual photo from an area that's sinking a little bit. And they've had some real problems there. San Joaquin Valley in California, this photo is really fun. So this was taken in 1977, and it showed at that point in time, this is the elevation the ground was in 1925, and you know, that's how much the ground had sunk over that period of time. So it can be really dramatic. Mexico City, Taipei, Taiwan, there's certain places around the world that have really had some serious infrastructure problems because of land subsidence. Now, San Joaquin, they have taken steps to stop this. It's no longer sinking substantially, but that's a real problem. Now, finally, there are economic impacts. As the water table declines, there are two problems. Number one, the deeper it is, the more energy it takes to pump the water to the surface. That can add up. That can be a really big thing. Furthermore, a lot of wells, they have a screen. The water table drops below the bottom of the screen. You've got to drill a new well. So I was reading an article the other day that said that the economic impacts of declining water levels in the western United States are costing hundreds of millions of dollars in extra energy costs and new well drilling costs. So there's a lot of reasons why we need to manage our groundwater sustainably. So in order to manage your groundwater sustainably, you have to control how much people pump. How do you do that? Well, let's look at this is managed through, I'm going to call it water rights management. It's not called that everywhere, but you can think of it that way. Let's look at some different models on some policies and strategies that government agencies have and water agencies have in managing groundwater withdrawal. So first of all, Texas. Texas is interesting. Not that many years ago, there was a significant court case in Texas where a judge ruled that, hey, if there's water under your property, it's yours, and you can pump it all you want. And so people did. It was, if you've ever studied sustainability, this is called the tragedy of the commons. If there's no limit, then people just go do a free-for-all. This is a map of water decline in Texas in feet. And notice this zone right here. This is between Dallas. It's down kind of the I-35 corridor down to Waco, maybe as far as Austin, and they have up to 1,000 feet, 800 to 1,000 feet of drawdown, which is insane that they've had there that due to this unsustainable pumping. This is the Ogallala Aquifer up in the Panhandle region. A lot of the water in the Ogallala Aquifer is glacial meltwater. And from when the glaciers went down that far, and it's kind of being, they're just kind of pumping it out, and it's on a collision course. But so this didn't work too well, and so about 5-6 years ago, maybe off a little bit, 5 to 10 years ago, let's say, they changed the laws in Texas, and now they kind of went the other way. Now they put a meter on your pumps, and you're required to have a meter, kind of like a water meter on your house, and then you have to pay for the water that you pump. And that actually having a rate to it it's a really simple way to control it, right? If you increase the rate, people are going to use water more economically, and they try to keep the rates reasonable, but that's how they're managing it now. Having people pay per use and trying to navigate that going forward. Back on the east coast of the U.S., I mean, there are a lot of places in the U.S. where they're more concerned with having too much water than not enough water, right? Dealing with floods and drainage and things like that. But even there, there are places where they've traditionally felt like they've had a never-ending supply of groundwater. They're starting to realize, hey, we're kind of in trouble. I've had an opportunity for the last 15 or 16 years to work with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality on their groundwater withdrawal permitting process. And there, they give permits that are good for 10 years. And if you want to apply for a new permit, there's a regulatory process you go through. You have to demonstrate that your pumping will not negatively impact your neighbors or existing water rights holders. And so there's some modeling that we do with the ModFlow model to analyze that. And then they're very careful. They try to balance it in a sustainable fashion. They have these critical thresholds that they're working on, and it's a good system. And then after 10 years, you have to reapply. And if you're not using the water efficiently or to beneficial use, they may give it to someone else. So it's not a permanent right, okay? Now, what do we do here in the western United States? Here it's kind of an entirely different mindset. And starting back, since the pioneer days, we have a system that is called prior appropriation water rights. Meaning you can own water rights for groundwater or surface water. It's usually designated on your water right. From a particular water source, be it an aquifer or a stream, and that's kind of like owning land. It's something that you can own. My father passed away in 2016. My mother passed away a year ago. I was the trustee of the estate, and one of the things, I sold her house and her property, but I also sold 4 shares of Summit Creek irrigation water rights in Santaquin, and I went on the market and sold them just like I would sell the land. It's interesting. And so, and these also have an order. So they're like shares of stock, and your water rights are for a specific amount of water. They're not all the same. And there's what's called a priority order. So let's suppose that you have a wet year, and you have a whole bunch of water, right? And this is the priority order. Whoops. So in a wet year, you can deliver water to everyone for the full amount. Everybody's happy, right? But let's suppose you have a dry year. Well, in a dry year, you've got this much water. Now, maybe you're only able to fully satisfy rights 1 through 4, and the rest are out of luck. Now, it's not always on, off, black and white. Sometimes there's a proportional shift, but I can tell you my parents' water shares in Santaquin, the last few years, the stream that came down the ditch to water their pasture and their garden area was a lot smaller than it is during the wet years. So that's how prior appropriation water rights work. Obviously, the value of your water right is going to be a lot higher if it's at a high in the list. It's worth less money if it's lower in the list. But these are like pieces of property. Okay? Now, with that background, I'd like to share with you a case study that I was involved with for about 10 years, from about 2010 to 2020, that involved groundwater, sustainable use, water rights, and it's something that was very critical, I think, for the western United States. and that is the Southern Nevada Groundwater Development Project. So the city of Las Vegas is part of the Colorado River Compact, which was established in early 1930s, if I recall correctly, that decided how the water from the Colorado River would be allocated. Well, at that time, Las Vegas was a little farming town, and they didn't get very much water, 350,000 acre-feet. Well, now Las Vegas is a big city. It's in the middle of the desert. They have golf courses and casinos and subdivisions, and it's a very thirsty city, and they need water. They don't have much water. So, 30 years ago, they had an idea. What if we went up to these valleys in east central Nevada and drilled a whole bunch of deep wells, like, hey, they've got extra water, and then pump that out, put it into a network of pipelines and pump it to Las Vegas. So that was the groundwater development plan. It would have involved 306 miles of pipeline, several lift stations. It would have been the largest interbasin transfer of water in U.S. history, the largest groundwater development project in the history of the world, with a cost of about $15 billion. And it would have taken over 20 years, 20 to 25 years to construct. This is a major, major water development project. This is Pat Mulroy, who is the head of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, who was instrumental in a lot of the planning and effort here. And they spent a lot of money planning this and working on it but trying to get approved. Well, in order for this to happen, they had to apply for new water rights up in these valleys. They went to the state engineer and said, hey, you have excess water that's being lost to evapotranspirate in these basins. We want to apply for these water rights and build this project. They had to get approval. Well, there's a process to do that, and when you do that, existing water rights holders or stakeholders can file opposition. There's kind of a legal process you go through. And of course, as you can imagine, all of the water rights holders and ranchers and cities up in this area are like, no, we don't want Las Vegas to steal all our water. And Las Vegas, don't worry, you'll be fine. And so this led, literally, to a 30-year battle over this project. And the Great Basin Water Network was a coalition of ranchers and landowners that fought this. There was also the Goshoot Indian tribe, had some really interesting objections. There's a set of a grove of, they're called swamp cedars. They're phreatophytes. The roots are in the basin, and back in the 1800s, a bunch of men, women, and children of their tribe were massacred there, and so it's a sacred place to them. Like, if you lower the water table, that grove is going to die. You know, you can't do that. It's part of our heritage, and so that was really interesting. Well, it turns out the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints got involved in this, and through that, I ended up getting involved. So how were they involved? So this is a map of the project, and these dots represent the proposed locations of the wells. Now, interestingly, a bunch of these wells were right here in what's called Snake Valley, which is right on the Utah-Nevada border. And for a long time, might have been too long ago for a lot of you to have a memory of it, but in the media there was a lot of talk about this because, as you can imagine, the farmers and landowners in Snake Valley on the Utah side were like, no, wait a minute. You can't put all those wells right on the border and not have an impact. The groundwater doesn't know where the border is, right? And so eventually the state of Utah officially opposed it. So they abandoned those wells, but most of the wells are right here in what's called Spring Valley. And it's just by Ely, Nevada. It's by Great Basin National Park, Mount Wheeler. And right in the middle of Spring Valley, there's a ranch called Cleveland Ranch, which about 13 years ago was purchased by the church. It's a cattle ranch, and the cattle from the Cleveland Ranch are used to support the church's welfare program, where through the bishop storehouses, food is given free to needy families. And so the Cleveland Ranch had, this is the property, the blue is the property of the Cleveland Ranch, yellow, and these are the grazing allotments and that they owned. And then over on the right, this is a map I made. These are the water rights owned by the Cleveland Ranch, and that includes a bunch of wells, discharge from streams, and a whole bunch of springs. It's called Spring Valley for a reason, but they filed, each one of these is listed as part of the Nevada list of water rights. They have a priority order and amount. A lot of these are really small. You know, we're talking, I mean, all told, they had, I think about 25,000 acre feet of water. That's you take an acre of land and fill it a foot deep. That's an acre foot. So 25,000 acre feet per year that they had rights to through a combination of these rights. And these dots here, so these red dots and the yellow dots represent the proposed location of the Southern Nevada Water Authority wells. It'd be screened over 1,000 feet, pump massive amounts of water, and the Southern Nevada Water Authority was saying, don't worry, this won't have any effect on your water rights, right? Even though they're right in the same spot. And so the church decided to, oh, by the way, this is a shot, so this is the Cleve Creek alluvial fan that's also right here. So you can see at the fringe of this alluvial fan, you got all this groundwater that discharges, all these springs, and there's a lot of grass, perfect for grass-fed cattle, right? And they have artesian wells in the area. Really a great place for a cattle ranch. And so, along with a lot of the other protesters, the church filed opposition, hired a legal team, and I was hired as the lead technical expert, along with Alan Mayo, who is a geology professor at BYU. And so we submitted, we did computer models, we submitted affidavits, spent a few days on the witness stand in court, presenting evidence. It was quite the thing. And so the concept, the argument, or the basis of the application for the water rights is something called evapotranspiration salvage. So the logic is, you've got, through this, looking down at the Spring Valley, in these red zones that I've highlighted, that's where, I mean, if you look at an aerial photo, that's where the groundwater is actively discharging through evapotranspiration and seepage to the ground, to the ground surface. And they estimated that there's about 92,000 acre feet lost every year to evapotranspiration. So they said, well, originally they wanted to pump the full 92,000, and the state, they ended up scaling that back to 65,000 acre feet. They said, well, we do that, we're going to be sustainable, right? It's going to be enough water, everything's good, right? And also, they had to argue that it would have no significant impact on existing water rights holders. So I was hired on this project. It's kind of a long story. The church wasn't allowed to object because of standing, and then they were allowed to object. I was hired in like July 1st. They said, you need to have all your evidence in by the end of August. And I said, well, I'm not going to build a model, so let's just use their model. They had a computer model, they being Southern Nevada Water Authority. I said, let's just dive into their data and look at what it's doing. And we looked at their model results, and first of all, I discovered that they were hiding the results of their model, the groundwater modeling scenarios. So, for example, they would say, well, here are some wells where the change in, or some springs where the change in discharge would be more than 15%. And I said, well, how much? 20%? 50%? Just, why won't you? They wouldn't say. And then they said, here are some locations where the drawdown would be over 50 feet. I'm like, how much over 50 feet? And so anyway, we got their model, we ran it, we found out that, well, and they ran their model for 200 years, but they only reported the results out to 75 years. So there are a lot of really fishy things going on. So we ended up using their model, and we showed in court that the water levels would decline as much as 200 feet by 200 years of pumping. Virtually all the springs, wherever they said greater than 15%, the real answer was 100%. All the springs would go dry. And further, what really surprised us, though, we looked at it, at the end of the 200 years, the water levels were still on a downward linear slope. It wasn't even close to coming to equilibrium. Well, that's a problem because the state of Nevada has a policy, a long-standing policy forbidding groundwater mining. And so we said, this goes against Nevada policy, this is not going to be sustainable. Even after 200 years, it's still going straight down. And so, in spite of that, the state engineer approved the project in 2012. And in response to our argument about sustainability, he said, the state engineer this is a quote from the ruling, there's no requirement the applicant must show that proposed well placement will actually be able to fully capture discharge. Means reach equilibrium. There's no practical way to require them to manage their groundwater operations collectively to reach full capture. State engineer finds the applicant is not required to prove capture of ET as a prerequisite for approval of the applications, which is ironic because the whole basis of the argument for new water rights is excess evapotranspiration. So we're going to give you these water rights because there's water being lost to evapotranspiration, but we don't care if you capture it all that. So we appealed that, and in district court, the 7th district court, the judge agreed with us and said, well, you're right, it doesn't matter maybe how long it takes to equilibrium, but you kind of have to show that it does reach equilibrium. So Jones and Mayo were right on that argument. And so he didn't overturn it. He said, you've got to go back and you have to make a case that it will eventually reach equilibrium, that it will eventually reach a sustainable condition, because you haven't. And then that was appealed for a few years, and then in 2017, we were back in court, and we had a new set of hearings. And so at that point, what we did, we ran the model for 2,000 years. Now, it's kind of ridiculous to run a model for 2,000 years, but we wanted to answer the question, does this ever reach equilibrium? And we found, even after 2,000 years, it didn't come to equilibrium. Because the problem is the location of the wells relative to the evapotranspiration discharge zones. If the wells were right up here and right down here, it probably would go to equilibrium. In fact, they actually showed that. But the problem is the wells are here. And this is a long, narrow valley. The only way you could ever get equilibrium up here is if you were to pump all of the water out of the southern part of the valley, causing the aggregate Kona Depression to migrate to the north. So effectively, you'd have to dewater the entire valley in order to reach a new state of equilibrium. Problem is, before it does that, once you start dewatering the southern end of the valley, instead of progressing the lower water levels up north, it just starts drawing water from the adjacent valleys. So we found that, and we said, this is fatally flawed, it'll never work, it'll never reach a sustainable condition. And went back to the judge in district court, and he said, well, according to this, actually what happened, the state engineer came out with the ruling saying, I have to kill the project, but I'm going to immediately appeal my own decision because I don't agree with the judge making us do this. But anyway, the judge said, forget it, it's dead. So that was the end of the Southern Nevada Groundwater Development Project, March of 2020. They abandoned it after 30 years and countless millions of investment because it wouldn't be sustainable. Now, one of the questions I'm often asked, why not just move the wells, right? The problem is they applied for the wells at these specific locations, and then in the subsequent 10, 20 years, other water users in the valley applied for other water rights, and so their applications which were at high on if they were to move the application, they'd have to start over. And if you start over, their water rights would go down to the bottom of the list in the priority order. Remember the slide I showed of the priority order? At that point, nobody's going to loan you $15 billion to develop a project that, yeah, you may get water on wet years, but not on the dry years. So that was effectively the end of the road for the Southern Nevada Water Authority. And this was one of the issues. The Gashute Indian tribe, their case was incredibly powerful. That was cited by the judge, but this was one of the main issues that effectively killed the project. And so for the time being, Spring Valley is going to remain green. One of the other objections to this project was it would change the ecology in the valleys. You drop the water table, all the grasses and plants that had been there for thousands of years would die and be replaced by sagebrush and cheatgrass, and so that was obviously a concern as well. So I would argue that it was a victory for sustainable groundwater management, and I do have empathy for Las Vegas. They've got a challenging problem providing water, but they're going to do it through conservation and other means, not diverting it from Spring Valley. So that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions you may have. Yes?
Is it common how like the state engineer created the model for you guys and was like, it will be more than like 15%, but never says exactly how much? Is it, like I know you weren't like a third, is it, like you weren't an outside company coming in, you were with the church, but like is it normal for someone else to come in and analyze the model, or do they usually get away with that kind of stuff?
So it wasn't the state engineer that created the model. The Southern Nevada Water Authority hired a bunch of consultants to create the model. In fact, one of the reasons the church was scrambling is they were trying to find a groundwater specialist in the western United States who wasn't already employed by the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Took them a long time to find someone. I wasn't, so that's how they found me. And but I have a lot of really good friends that were working for Southern Nevada, and I don't fault them for that. I have never seen a more sophisticated groundwater model in my career. I read an article once that said they'd spent over 2,000 person years building that model. It's incredibly complex, and it was part of they developed it initially for the environmental impact statement they had to file with the EPA, and then they also used it to try to demonstrate that it would have minor impact, but it was a tough sell. I mean, they were trying to pitch it in a way that made the case, but it was, a careful reading of it was pretty easy to see that something wasn't right. And for the Great Basin Water Network had been working for a lot of years, but somehow they missed it. I don't know, they were looking at other things, but luckily we took a really close look at that because it ended up being a pivotal part of changing the case. So, yeah.
Are you saying they didn't do that on purpose? They didn't skew the data?
No, they did. I'm saying that they were faced with a really, they're advocating for their client, right? And so they presented it in a way that was favorable, but
lied. I mean, it sounds like it comes close to perjury to me, because they're going into court, into a state document.
It wasn't as much a lie as well, you could argue it's a lie. It was, they weren't presenting the data. So that map I showed of the drawdown, they had maps of the drawdown, but they were literally they had a whole bunch of figures in the appendix that were literally this big with a little teeny colored dot in the middle. You couldn't read it, right? And so, but that came back to bite them in the end. ended up working out for us. But see, the case you're making is in front of the state engineer. The state engineer wanted to approve the project. Las Vegas is critical for the economy of Nevada. And so they actually went through several state engineers through this, and everyone was 100% support, including this one, Jason King. But the only thing that saved us in the end was the appeals court, at the district appeals court, who actually looked in at the, sometimes at that level they don't really appreciate the science, but the judge really got the science and ruled in our favor. So doesn't always happen. Yes?
A close by neighbor is St. George, and they have a sustainability problem too.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
I know that like the Barrel Enterprise Aquifer, which is just a little bit north of there, we've studied that pretty extensively, and it's on a massive decline. I'm not as familiar with the specific issues in St. George. I do know, so one of my former students is the head of the groundwater withdrawal permitting for the state of Utah. And he said that for a long time they would, before his time there, for going back decades, people would come and apply for groundwater and they'd say, well, you know, we only have, they're asking for 50,000 acre feet, but we're going to assume they won't use all that. They're going to use 35,000. So they did their budgeting based on the assumption that people wouldn't use the full amount. Well, guess what? People are using the full amount. So they're over allocated. So now they're in a, how do you pull that back, right? It's tough, but there actually is a process whereby they're trying to shift that back and encourage conservation. And but it's a tough problem. It's a really tough problem.
Well,
It's one thing to just say, hey, you can't pump more, but okay, where do we get our water, right?
they're trying to get it from Lake Powell, but is that sustainable?
Not right now, not in a drought.
They're still asking for that pipeline, even though the mouth of the pipeline is now below or above the level of.
Yeah, so one of the proposals for St. George is to build a pipeline from Lake Powell across southern Utah. The state of Utah was given a pretty generous amount of water in the Colorado River Compact. We haven't fully utilized that. Part of it, the Central Utah Project, takes a lot of water that normally drained to the Colorado River, and it pumps it across the Wasatch Mountains and down to the Wasatch Front. And thank heavens, because of the growth we have, I don't know what we'd do without that water. But yeah, so that's, as far as I know, it's still a no-go on the pipeline. You know, might have to scale back some golf courses. Yeah.
Do you monitor, that is, does the state monitor wells that are privately owned? And how do they monitor how much water is being extracted from?
Yeah, what if someone cheats, right? That's a great question. I think it's mostly an honor-based system. Like I say, in Texas, they require meters, and the state puts the meter on, they come read them. I watched a really interesting presentation. In Taipei, Taiwan, they have really serious subsidence problems. And it was driven to a large part by people with illegal wells in their backyard. So they were using computer models and monitoring wells to see where the cones of depressions were and infer from that where the wells were pumping, and kind of using forensics to find the illegal wells. But we're not in that state right now. But you know, with the growth on the Wasatch, I tell my students, I say, you want to go into water resource management? This is a growth industry. It's a great career right now. Number one, you're doing something that's really important and useful and benefits society, but job security, you'll never be without a job, because we have a growing population and a finite supply of fresh water. So how we manage it is more and more important as we go on, and they're not easy answers, but it's at the same time there is a lot we can do. I mean, you talk to an economist and they'll just say there's a simple problem, just charge market rate for the water, and if you need to scale back, but that doesn't work with prior appropriation water rights, right? Because you have to take away people's rights, so it's tough.
I
Yeah.
understand that a colleague of mine did some studies on groundwater wells in the area of Spanish Fork.
Uh-huh.
And he discovered that there are a lot of abandoned wells.
There are a lot of what?
Abandoned wells.
Abandoned wells.
People who have
Yeah.
water, wells in their backyard, but that the state have no idea. I've worked with the health department and they don't even know, they don't even have a license for it.
Wow, yeah.
How do we? Difficult? Because,
It's a problem. Yeah.
I had a quick question, this is something I've always wondered. You talk about saltwater intrusion.
Yeah.
Do you know if we have saltwater intrusion issues with the Great Salt Lake at all?
I've heard about that, actually.
Groundwater use near the Great Salt Lake? I'm not sure.
I've
Yeah.
never heard it, I always thought we might, but I've never heard of it.
Yeah. You know, there's groundwater down to a great depth. Now, the deeper you go, the less pore space there is, but also the deeper you go, the more saline the water gets, and so, the best water is right at the surface, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I heard that the Great Salt Lake, the salinity moves up and down Jordan River, so I imagine we all have that problem in Jersey.
Yeah,
I imagine.
not sure. Biggest problem now at the Great Salt Lake is it's drying up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about the success or what's going on with the Provo recharge?
Yeah, so one of the ways that we can creatively help manage our groundwater sustainably is aquifer storage and recovery. And in a nutshell, you take excess water in the spring that would normally maybe drain out to evaporate in the desert, and we only have so much reservoir capacity, right? Well, right now we can fill up the reservoirs, but when the reservoirs are full, say, rather than just letting that go, they capture the water and they pump it into the ground. And they use the aquifer as a reservoir. It's called aquifer storage and recovery. They implemented this in Highland a few years ago, and I knew the mayor was an engineer, and he said the first year, after a year or two, they were saving $100,000 a year in energy costs because they brought the water table up. But they're studying it extensively. Bar Engineering is doing a study for City of Provo, and I've actually have a group of students on a capstone project working with Bar Engineering to look at their data. They're looking at implementing aquifer storage and recovery in Provo on a bigger scale. There's a project in Spanish Fork, I believe, that's working now. They take water from Spanish Fork Canyon and inject it into the ground. So that's a great tool to use to help with this problem.
The city of Tucson does the same thing. They actually, their Colorado River shares, they actually put it in the ground so it doesn't evaporate.
Yeah.
That way they can store it to get it out later. So, anyways, we're out of time, so thank you so much for Dr. Jones. Appreciate it. And so, anybody else have any questions afterwards? If Dr. Jones has time, come
Sure.
on up. So, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Even today, I'm talking about basically the same issue in my groundwater class.
Really?
So I was like, oh, we all see those slides. So-
Oh, have at it, yeah, sure.
Hello, Matt, how you doing?
Hey,
Nice to
pretty
see you.
good. How you doing? Hey, Norm.
Hey.
I'm Dan Olson's youngest.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've heard.
I
that.
see the family
I
resemblance.
know. I looked at you and I was like, oh, it's like Aaron.
Oh, yeah, how about that?
Are you Aaron's brother?
I'm his younger brother, yeah. I'm the youngest, so.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. This.
Yeah,
that's
I
really
love your
interesting.
dad, he's a great man.
Yeah, he seems like he's pretty busy right now.
Yeah.
Oh
yeah.
Being fully retired.
Yeah, the mayor, he bit that off.
Yeah. I mean, they're trying to make some plans with the reservoir right now too.
Yeah.
With this the Colorado River diversion that comes down, they're kind of
Yeah,
getting
yeah.
the line, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you should probably reach out to you.
Yeah. So years ago, he had this idea of putting a reservoir in Polk
Oh,
Canyon.
I've heard all
So
about it.
I worked with him on that.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, I've definitely heard of that. I teach a few classes here in the now.
Oh, really?
Just defended my PhD up at University of Utah.
We'll still have next.
What's your,
Three Tuesdays.
what's your
I will.
department?
It's geography technically, but it's glaciology and snow hydrology. So I do a lot with the hydrologists here, like a little conduit canyon.
Yeah.
We'll see. Either way.
Measuring the snowpack. So